recording. Okay. Oh, yeah, and I should always remember to lead with sharing my screen. Okay. So, we're doing Genesis chapter 5. Thank you all for coming. All right. Adam's descendants to Noah. This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them and named them man. When they were created, when Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image. He named him Seth. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the sons of Seth were 912 years, and he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. Enosh lived after he fathered Kenan 815 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he fathered Mahalalel. Kenan had lived after he fathered Mahalalel 840 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he fathered Jared. Mahalalel lived after he fathered Jared 830 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years. He died. When Jared had lived 162 years, he fathered Enoch. Jared lived after he fathered Enoch 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Jared were 962 years. He died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he fathered Lamech. Methuselah lived after he fathered Lamech 782 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son, and his name was Noah, saying, Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. Lamech lived after he fathered Noah 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. After Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Okay, so um, we're gonna mostly talk about this chapter kind of in broad strokes. The only portions that will probably break up a little bit is the Enoch part. Um, but I broadly want to answer the question: um, what are the genealogies doing here in the text? Uh, and a lot of this is, for my view, is going to be centered around William Lane Craig's idea of the text as mytho-history. And really, if you wanted to break it up, kind of the the previous few sections are what really make it fall into the mytho camp of mythology, and then here being one of genealogies, but there were previous ones, but this one and especially the one in Genesis 11 in particular, um, are what situate it as history, right? Um, these these genealogies, um, they change the stories from just being in a unknown, distant, primordial past, right? It's not once upon a time. It's like this specific period of time, right? It and so there's an attempt to situate it in time, and there's also an attempt to start from one period of time and go back. There are some other um, of these genealogy lists that are in other uh, um, ancient Near Eastern documents, and some of those, not all of them, but some of them, they'll rather than doing the form of starting uh, like in the distant past and working your way up to the future, what it does is it starts with the present and says like in the reign of King blah 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 blah, whose father was blah blah blah, whose father was blah blah blah, and whose father was, and it works its way back, right? Um, uh, that kind of a difference, along with the difference, and so um, one of the main comparisons that academics will make from these genealogy lists are to the and especially given the long ages listed in here. So right, 900 ish or so years, right? Um, they'll do a comparison between that and the Sumerian kings list, which I think if you just type in Sumerian kings list, uh, I think you can just like find the PDF. Does this have it? No. Uh, it, it it's usually, yeah, just yeah. Not the one I'm looking for. No, that's a book about it. Anyways, I found it earlier. If I was better at my job, I would have already had it up. But the important thing that I want to contrast with the Sumerian king list is exactly kind of this point right here, which is that the kings in that live crazy long periods of time, like 20, 30, 40,000 year time spans, um, crazy long periods of time. And so there's something going on there with these numbers and that text and with uh, these numbers here in Genesis. And there are many different uh, theories about what those numbers are doing. I'm not fully sold on it, but the theory that I think has probably the most uh, going for it is where I put this link. Um, and it is the idea that the numbers are using a I don't know how to say this word, sexagesimal uh, number system. For a long time, I thought this was a I like if you watch Inspiring Philosophy has some videos on these, and he keeps referring to them as base 60 base 60 numbering systems, and uh because I have like my minor in mathematics and I know what it means to say like a base 2 number system, a base 10 number system, a base 12 number system. I For a long time I was reading them like that, and I'm like, I don't understand how people are getting a base 60 system, and that's not really what's going on. I think I'm doing a little bit of a that's a misunderstanding on my part and causing an anachronism. But this chart is actually pretty useful for trying to describe what it thinks is going on here, right? So like for Adam, so what it is it's different units of in combinations of 60 um 60 years and 60 months. So 60 months is 5 years because 5 times 12 is 60. And so if you have two instances of 60 years, that's 120, and then two instances of 60 months, that's 130, right? And you can read the article that I posted, but it basically goes through here and shows that you can do some kind of combination of the numbers 60, either dealing with years or months, and then 10 and 2 and 5 and 7. And you can pretty much get all of the years that are listed. Not exactly, but a lot of them. What is that supposed to signify? It'll get a little bit hazy. If you read in here, a lot of places it'll just say like it had religious significance and it showed harmony. Okay, that's where a little bit of this like theory ends up losing me. Um, right, and but very clearly, and so like this thing will make the point that right, the chance that all of the numbers would end in 0572 is 1 in a billion, right? As compared to if they were all just random numbers. And if they were real ages, we would expect them to be all random numbers. That being said, I don't know why it's not just also a plausible theory that if you're dealing with ages from people that are a long time ago, you just rounded the numbers. Um, that seems like it's also a fine solution. Um, but there you go. One okay, and so while we're here, kind of on this point, um, to Christian's question, which he asked, do I take these numbers literally? And the answer is no. And the reason why is not because I like reject out of hand the idea that God could make human beings that lived a long time. That's not it. It's not like we have no scientific evidence for it. Blah blah blah. It's not that. The main reason why I don't take these numbers as literal um, is because I don't actually think that the Bible takes them as literal. What do I mean by that? The If you go back and listen to a lot of my uh, Bible studies, especially about Mark and everything, and it's going to keep coming up in Genesis. But I kind of try to tell people that you need to like to understand what's going on, you sort of also need to understand not just like the context, but the thematic elements of what's going on. And to me, one of the most obvious uh, examples of a thematic element that is going on here with these genealogies is that they are supposed to imply long passages of time, right? These, the, what these uh, genealogies act as in the story, they act as bridges that go from like, okay, we have this story here that's about kind of the like that's about the beginning, it's about the creation, and then we have like a little bridge to this other little story, and then we have a little bridge to this other little story, and then we have the bridge to this other story, right? And the bridges are the genealogies. And so because of that, whenever you get to the stories, and it's going to really break apart once we get to Abraham. um, you start to see. So like my biggest problem. Oh, oops, let's not do that. What is this? My biggest problem is not the length of these; it's how much overlap there is between them, right? Like uh, so in this chart, right, we have Noah right here. We have Noah right here. So Noah's dad, Lamech, is born before Adam dies, right? So if you take these as literal, right, you you have right that that list that we just read is supposed to be going from Adam to Noah, right? And it seems very strange to me that um there basically would be no like when we get to the story of Noah, it implies like that Noah is like the only good guy around, right? Like that's sort of what the whole point of the story of Noah is. But what's strange is like what none of these ancestors were good guys, and so like you have that kind of a problem. You have another problem whenever you get down here to Abraham, because like when Abraham is born, uh, let's count it now. So that's his father, that's his grandfather, great 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 grandfather Shem dies 2 years before Abraham, right? Which, and when we get to that list, it's a similar thing where it's like Shem is the start of that list, going from Noah down to Abraham, right? Because they're both 10 generation lists. Um, and to me, one of the main thematic elements of the story of Abraham is the fact that he is a quote old man, right? Like that's the whole thing with Abraham and uh, Sarah. It is that they're old and like they're too old to have kids. Whenever like if all of this was actually supposed to be taken as literal in the text, it doesn't really follow because um there should be surviving ancestors, um some of which survive almost as long as Abraham does, who potentially are even having more kids at that point, right? Like there's a disconnect between this idea of, oh, they lived these long lives and they had all of these children, and then we get to Abraham, and Abraham seems to be acting like, oh, it hasn't been that way for a super long time, except for if we were to take these years as literal, there's literally people alive who are crushing Abraham's age, right? um that's what I mean by, I don't think that the Bible is taking these ages literally. Now, what are some of our other options? Um, I already spoke about the one option being that there's something going on with these numbers. The other option is that uh, is basically this is a more, I guess, liberal academic idea. Whenever they talk about clan identities, and so we've already talked about it a little bit, but it'll keep popping up, and it'll pop up more once we get to Abraham. But the idea that names in the Old Testament can be the name of an individual, they can be the name of a people group, they can be the name of a specific city, but they can also be the name of like an area or a country, right? They can be all of these different things kind of interchangeably and at the same time. And we will definitely end up seeing places in the text, and when you see it throughout the Old Testament, where it plays with names being an individual versus a collective. The most obvious one being Israel. It'll do this with Jacob and Isaac, or sorry, Jacob and Esau, right? And the idea of you have two nations in your womb, right? Um, uh, and then when we'll see this with the one that I always remember is like Shechem. I think I have that right. Like Shechem is like it's a guy's name. There's an actual guy named Shechem, but then there's also a city named Shechem, and I think there's like a tribe that's like named Shechem, and it's like all like kind of together. Um, the only other thing that I kind of wanted to address, kind of in like a holistic fashion, is so there's a popular idea. So I don't know. So the Step Bible actually used to be really good for giving you meanings of people's names. And so it used to be like you could click on it, and then over on the side it would tell you what the meaning in Hebrew was of that person's name. I think they've changed it up, and so now it'll just say like a person living at this such and such a time, which is kind of unhelpful. Um, but you can look it up. So like I found one, and this person had it. So, anyways, there's an idea that what's going on here in Genesis 5 is if you take all of the names, um, basically starting from Adam and then going down to Noah, if you take all of those names, and their meanings, it kind of makes like a hidden message, and it ends up saying a sentence. And so this person on Reddit posted this 6 years ago, but from other stuff that I found, this is basically it. And the sentence comes out to something like, "Man is appointed mortal sorrow, but the blessed God shall come down teaching that his death shall bring the despairing rest." Um,
Do you mind if I ask you a quick question on that, Kyle? I don't want to.
Well, so
Yeah.
I'll just go ahead and say my opinion.
Yeah, go ahead. Well, not my opinion. It's actually a legit question, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, my opinion on it is, uh, you shouldn't do this. um, uh, First of all, a lot of the name meanings don't match up, and there's a lot of stretching of different people's meanings to get that conclusion. Um, and so I think that this sort of a thing has become, and I've referred to this in past about other things. I refer to these as Christian woozles. Um, and so a Christian woozle is an idea that kind of gets a hold. It's almost like a meme that gets a hold in Christian communities, and they're not really true, but they sound kind of good or interesting. Um, the two that I always remember are the idea that the high priest had a rope tied around them, so that whenever they went in, if they if the high priest, whenever they went into the holy holies, if they died, they could drag him out with the rope. That's not true. They never did that. And then the other one is the idea that Gehenna was a garbage dump outside of the city of Jerusalem where they burned trash. Gehenna is a valley that's on the outside of Jerusalem, but there's no evidence that they ever used it as a trash dump where they burned trash. So like th- those those sorts of ideas kind of creep into people's heads and they get passed along without people really doing like good scholarship. And this is one of those things where I think people are sort of passing it along without doing good scholarship. That being said, kind of similar to how I mentioned a couple weeks ago, uh, in regard to I think something that I said to Katie um, about like the garments of skin and about how she read this thing about how like the garments of skin had this hidden meaning about them being that they were actually priestly robes, and so God was making priestly robes for Adam and Eve. And I'm like, no, um, you shouldn't think that there's a hidden meaning there, but that doesn't mean that there's no meaning there, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't pay attention to it. There is meaning there, and there's a link between garments of skin and what's happening there as a function to the garments that a priest uses. There's still a connection. And so, while on one hand, I want to specify that I don't think that this very on the nose, basically strict prediction of uh, what Christ is going to end up doing. I don't think that's what's happening here. That being said, I do think that there are significance to the names in talking about the general trajectory um, and theming that I have talked about previously whenever I talk about this idea of sort of a battle between the the people that seek to create a name for themselves and those that seek to follow the name Hashem, right? And we'll talk about that more. But I want to kind of compare. I was so like in my head, it's a little bit like okay, so we have a house in South Carolina, and uh, we painted the room orange, right? And so if you walk into the room and it's painted orange, you can infer, right? You can look at it and go, oh, this is a bright color, right? I guess people, whenever they came in, the people that decided that this room should be orange wanted to be kind of happy and uplifted whenever they entered the room, right? That's one way that you can kind of be like, oh, is there a hidden um, message in the idea that someone painted this room orange? The other way that you could do it is go, oh, this room is painted orange. Orange the name orange comes from a very specific fruit, and so the person that named this, or that decided that this room should be orange, they wanted to eat a lot of this fruit whenever they came into the room, right? Like both of those are kind of like an esoteric analysis, but one is reasonable and the other is way too on the nose. And so what I'm arguing for is whenever we look at these names, I think it is okay to look at the name meanings and to get a kind of general thematic sense about where the story is going and how it is acting, especially with Noah's name. Whenever we talk about rest, we're going to end up talking about a lot of that whenever we get into chapter 6. Um, that being said, I think it's too on the nose to be like, oh, let's let's turn these names into a very specific prophecy about Jesus. That I think is going too far. That's all I was going to say, Christian. You can ask your question if I didn't answer it.
Well, actually, you kind of did because you shut down the entire
Yeah,
methodology. So I was going to ask about the methodology, like, um, would it be, was there, would you, if somebody were to make the argument, are they making the argument that there's authorial intent, or that it was a divine act where that they didn't know what they were doing, they didn't know they were creating this pattern,
sure,
but that somehow that, God inscribed this hidden meaning upon the text.
right. And and I think what we will like if
Like,
it's true, like both of those questions kind of hinge on the idea that something is going on there, with the names. Um, and I would think from a Christian perspective, we would want to say that it's a little bit of both, right? Um, that there's a little bit of authorial intent with the human writer, um, because one of the other options, which I didn't mention, is that maybe what's going on here is not right, as we talked about before about how the Hebrews could be kind of loose with the term father, right? Um, and so maybe Seth isn't a direct descendant of Adam, but is rather maybe Adam is like the grandfather of Seth, right? Or maybe maybe Seth is a couple of generations down from Adam, something like that. And so if there's skipping of generations going on, if that's what's happening, well, then you could make an argument that, okay, well, why did he pick these specific names, right? Because if if that's what's happening, then, well, why would you pick these names? Well, maybe you pick the names because they are significant in other stories, like Enoch, right? Enoch might be significant to other stories that are around, and so you make sure that you mention Enoch in in the list. But maybe Jared isn't, like, you don't have any other stories about Jared, so why did you pick his name? And so if there's actually more than 10 generations going on here, well, then maybe there was some authorial intent in choosing these specific names, and maybe it was to, hide some kind of message in there. I could see that being somewhat plausible. I can also see the other side of it, as in, no, these names were picked for whatever reason, oral tradition, whatever it is, and God was overseeing it to put this message in there. That being said, if that is what God was doing, it becomes one of those things where uh, it's not it's not really clear until after Jesus, right? Like this whole thing about like God shall come down teaching that his death shall bring the despairing rest, like there's not really a framework for the Jewish person to believe what's going on there. Now, that being said, you do end up getting something like this in Isaiah, but in Isaiah, we don't like this is sort of one of my things about like why I try to argue against the woozles, because most of the time we just don't need them. Like there's we like as Christians, we don't really gain anything by there being a secret message and prophecy coming from Genesis to this prediction, because we already have the prediction, right? Like that's what Isaiah is doing. And so like there's a certain level of it's like just let Isaiah do what Isaiah is doing and let Genesis do what Genesis is doing. And like we it doesn't they don't always need to be like at the end of the day, it's all going to point back to Jesus anyways. We don't have to artificially point it back to Jesus. Does that make sense? That's sort of like my position on
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense for sure. I mean, um, I think that you could look at it more as like, and I don't even necessarily believe um, what those individuals are claiming, but um, you could with that type of stuff, you would probably say it's more supplemental
it. Yeah,
than that it's foundational.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
I'd agree with that.
and and I think even the New Testament does this a little bit. Like where Paul, Paul interpreted in a midrashic form, and many times that is very layered interpretation. But it didn't necessarily, like, change the original meaning. It was just saying, "Hey, there could be layered truth here. There could be layered meaning. I'm not erasing or getting or abrogating what's here or what's original, but I'm showing you that there's a little more you can illuminate this further," like he does that in Galatians with the word seed,
Yes, yes,
and people take that and they run with it and they go see see Jacob's children were not the seed. It's like,
yes,
no, no, they were.
yeah.
They were.
And
They were, and Jesus is the ultimate seed, but they
yes,
were still the seed. So
yeah,
it's like there's like layered meaning and layered truth. And so that's where I don't necessarily have a problem with it. I do agree with you where it's like you try to present that to a person or really anybody for that matter and go, see, I've got you, I've here, it's all laid out here, and it's like Bible code. Remember the whole Bible code
yes,
thing?
exactly.
And the thing about the whole Bible code thing, and I didn't study it too much, but I'm pretty sure at times there were messages that were a little bit that conflicted with what you would have wanted to hear, you
Well,
know.
yeah, like if you
Yeah.
like
So that's all I gotta say.
like I know back in like the mid like in the mid 2000s, like a lot of that Bible code stuff was like really big, and I studied it a little bit, and the main thing that I learned from like a lot of the Bible code stuff was like, oh, you can actually do this with any document. Like if you're gonna parse stuff up and kind of look for meaning and things, you can do this with a phone book, right? and it becomes a thing of okay, you're this is it starts approaching like what people talk about whenever they say like eisegesis, right? And that's sort of why I want to steer people away from that. And it's not that like as you said that like yes, there are multiple instances where there's layered meanings going on, and we'll talk about that here in a second whenever we talk about Enoch, right? Like there I think that there are instances where there are layered meanings, but um it's I think we need to be careful about how we teach people to interact with those layered meanings. Um, and I want to avoid the TikTok. engagement bait um, aspects of these sorts of things, where people will just be like, look at this thing that proves the Bible is true, bam, and then they'll just say something, and it's like, okay, now you just tied this like pet kind of plausibly might be true, might be not theory that you have about Genesis 5 to the Bible being true. And it's like, that's not really what you should base whether or not you think the Bible is true on. Like you should not base it off of the names in Genesis 5, right? Like there are much better reasons to think that the Bible is true than hidden messages and names in Genesis 5, right? And that's sort of my goal around that. What time? Oh, actually, we sort of gone on for a long time. Maybe this will be the whole thing. Uh, so kind of the only other part that I wanted to talk about was this little section on Enoch, um, and uh, just to reiterate the idea of walking with God, um, and for our our extra meanings, right, our layered meanings, right. All the days of Enoch were 365 years, right, and obviously 365 is supposed to be a reference to the number of days that are in a year, and right, and so this sentence, right, thus all of the days of Enoch were 365 years. There's a play going on with um, the days being interspliced with years, right? And we had this in previous chapters of Genesis of like, well, are the days long periods of time, right? And so like really like uh you you should be getting the the theme. I think that the theme that you should be getting here is, right, we are starting to have time, right, we are starting to have time, and mankind is trying to figure out how to deal with the fall in time, and um the way that man has figured out how to deal with the fall involves things that we dealt with in the last chapter, where it's power structures, right? And and now we have uh, a slightly different path that involves some kind of idea of trying to walk with God, and the result of that, very strangely, is that you become not, you become nothing, right? And he was not, right? And this is one of the things that and he was not, for God took him, right? Technically, we really don't know what that means, right? Because um if you just wanted to say like if you just wanted to say that he died, like you can say like, oh, he became nothing as a euphemism for dying, but everywhere else they say that the person died, right? And so this is where we get, and for God took him, he was not, and for God took him, we this is where we get the idea that Enoch is just kind of uh for a lack of a better term, raptured uh up into heaven, and we don't think that Enoch really died, and this ends up becoming a um whenever we start to get into the Second Temple period, this is where you get references to the Book of Enoch and all that stuff, which we won't fully discuss here. Go see Michael Heiser to talk about all of that stuff. Although we will talk about it a little bit next week, or not next week, the next time that we meet, whenever we get to Genesis 7, which will be sometime in the new year. Um, but the the point that I want to make out of this is to say that um, I want us to remember this at remember this progression of time whenever we go forward, and also to reiterate what I was trying to say of how uh, God is going to start using time as a weapon, and uh, I actually think that this part with Enoch is sort of the first instance of that, because so far in this story we've mostly just have had falls, and Enoch is the first kind of, hey, somebody did something a little bit right, um, and that sort of that sort of, hey, somebody did something a little bit right, that's going to become uh, that becomes a little preview of the story that takes place next, which is Noah. And what we're going to start to see in Genesis is that it does this, it'll keep doing this thing where um, sort of throwaway lines are little mini little mini stories of like a bigger story that's about to come. And sometimes that bigger story that's about to come is in Genesis it, itself, and then other times it's in the Pentateuch, and then sometimes uh, it relates to Jesus, and it's way out in time, right? But we're gonna we're gonna get these um, little bumps back up, um, whenever we're talking about the overall trajectory of the story. Um, I will basically end it there. That was pretty much all that I wanted to say. Um, were there any more questions?
I mean, I have thoughts, but I don't want to take it over. So,
Well,
um,
we got time. Go for it.
well, one thing I would say, and again, I don't want to take it over. I'm sure other people might want to say some stuff too, but um, is I don't necessarily think that I think that layered meaning opens the door to where you can have multiple explanations in a way and they don't compete with one another, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, like, for example, you could say that something is historical and yet there is metaphor, there is allegory, there is this.
Yep.
And you see that all throughout the scripture. I mean, jumping away from Genesis, of course, like the entire history of Israel is real,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's steeped in typology and metaphor and allegory, and so like that's the angle I might come at this from, is like um in terms of the ages. And I want to, and to be honest with you, I want to better understand the argument because I can't say I fully understand the counter argument to these ages not being literal. That's the truth. Like I it sounds like there's a variety of theories out there
Oh,
for
for sure. Yeah. There's a
yeah, it sounds like there's a variety of theories for what they could be. A question I would have is it possible, like, could you take these ages as literal in another sense? Like, they're like, and I'm probably gonna do really bad explaining this because it's off the cuff, but could these could 900 years actually mean, multiply it by 6 and everything's multiplied by 6 and that, I'm not
Right.
saying that
No, no,
precisely. I'm just
no.
saying like they're literal in one sense.
So
They're
so th-
just yeah, yeah.
so there's this is sort of what I was trying to mean whenever I said like base 10. So um like okay, we're gonna end up talking about something completely different for a second. But so binary, right? So whenever you see something in binary, right? It's using it's
Yeah.
using it's using ones and zeros for things, right? And
Mhm. Yep.
so like if I were to show you, so we'll just do this the in the classroom chat, right? So like if I type that number, right? You would say that that number is 10, right? Because we work off of a base 10 system. But if we're working off of a base 2 system, right, which is what binary is, that number is 2, right? And so I'm using the same symbols, but I mean a different value. And so, sort of what you're trying to ask is okay, like, were they working off of a different like base number, right? And so for example, right, and I can like scale this up, right? I do that number, right? In binary, that's oh my gosh. That's 4. Okay? Right? And so suddenly you, like your your factors for like how you're doing the math, like it's a little bit complicated because like okay, if this is 2 and this is actually 4, you're like okay, maybe it's some complicated equation where I subtract like most of it and it becomes complicated. Um, but you could have something where it's like oh okay, they're using some other groupings to identify things, and that's possible. The problem is that we don't really know what they would have been using. And the other issue is if they if they are doing something like that, we don't know why they're doing that, and we don't know um we don't know what base system that they're using, right? Because I could take these same numbers, right, like the 10 and the 100, and if I make it base 8, right, which is like oct or right. Okay,
Mhm. Yeah.
that 10 is now um that 10 is now I think that's like 9 or something like that. I'm off. Actually, oh
No,
no,
it's all
it
good.
would
I
it
I
would be a
I
great
follow
number.
what you're saying. I'm gonna research it a little bit more and like think through it a little bit further. So you don't have to figure out all the precise math right now.
No, well, because there's not precise math, right? Because we don't. But I'm trying to illustrate the point that if there is something like a lot of times like the academic analysis will be like we think something's going on here but we don't fully know what it is, and that's sort of as far as you can take it a lot of times. And so yes, there's multiple ways in which those could be real ages, right? There's right, and that's what I'm trying to say, like it might be that it's ages of um a clan in ascendancy, right? Like it might just be like, okay, how long did this clan kind of rule the area for, right? It could be it could be that okay, it's a different numbering system and we just have the numbers off, right? Because it could just be like a translation error, right? And like maybe somebody long ago like knew what those numbers were and we've lost how those numbers work or how it got translated, right? And so right, because we have the issue of okay, like who's the original author, right? Go with like a mosaic authorship thing of like, okay, well, where did Moses get those numbers from? And then you get into the whole dictation versus oral tradition argument and all that stuff. And so to me, that's sort of why I try to stay on the like, what does it, what would it have meant to like the people at the time, or with what does it mean in the narrative right there, and that's where I think it I think we can glean more from that. Whereas if we try to go down, and it does, there could be literal interpretations out there, but I just don't think that we have access to them. Is basically where I'm trying to argue.
Do you view the numbers as qualifiers? In other words, hey, we have the genealogy here, and this number is acting as a qualifier to lock this genealogy in as like a kind of uh, like to take any possible movement out of it, if that makes sense. Like,
Um, I don't know if that's the exact way that I would describe it, but something like that, right? Yeah, like it is like the number at the very least. I do think that you can say that the numbers are put in there to to do what, like I said, which is that they are trying to demonstrate that there is like a passage of time, right? Like that's what the numbers are there to do. Like it and it is there to right, like it's not um so I get to kind of your point, right? Like if you were to like compare it to the Samaritan to the Sumerian list, it's not 20,000 years, right? Adam doesn't live 20,000 years. Like he lives a thousand, almost a thousand, right? Um, and so there is some kind of like uh uh there is some kind of like orders of magnitude estimation locking in that's going on there, right? Like a lot of times, if you ever like have conversations with people about like estimating things and trying to estimate very big things, one of the things that is that they don't try to, right, if you're like, okay, give me an estimate for the number of like grains of sand that are on a beach, right? You don't say like 5 million and 9 and all this other stuff. Like once you get towards the smaller numbers, you just round, right? You round all of that off. And so it could be, right, if I'm understanding what you're saying a little bit, it could be that like uh right, so like I guess what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to help you make like a young earth creationist argument, right? Like I think it is probably a little bit valid to say that like, okay, the text might be trying to lock in like an orders of magnitude thing there. Now now that I've kind of tried to help your young earth creationist dating system so that you can get to your 6,000 years, because this is where everybody gets their numbers so that they can date their 6,000 years, right? um the the old earth argumentation for that will be, well, actually this just gives us um our rough orders of magnitude estimates for how long human history is, not the age of the earth, but that we should be able to track human history within this the time frame of a, a few thousand years, right?
is that your view? Do you take the view that Adam, was based upon these lists? Adam was 6,000 or so years ago, or is that
I
the
mean,
view you
roughly.
take?
So like if you look at it like
Oh, okay, interesting.
if you look at like a reasons to believe, or like
Yeah.
William Lane Craig. William Lane Craig pushes it back for further for other reasons, right? But yeah, like uh, and so this will even this is reminding me of another like a debate that I've had with Evan, right? Where people will be like, was there a historical Adam? And like the thing is that it's like, okay, do we mean that there like was a person, and if you went and if you had a if you had magic Google Translate, that you could figure out whatever his language was, and you could ask him, hey, what is your name? And he would say the word Adam. Like the likelihood of that is no. He probably did not. Whoever the first man was who called himself Adam probably didn't even refer to himself as Adam, right? That's the name that we give to the first person, right? And like the idea is that of course there is like a first person. We just don't know when that first person showed up. Um, and so yes, it is my view that I think that uh, the first human, whenever that first human came about, and I'm open to various ideas about that creation, but I generally believe in de novo um, human creation because, as I've mentioned before, I have issues with evolution. Um, but I do kind of in my head I usually put it at about like 10,000 years ago. Um,
Oh, okay.
for various reasons, but that's like a rough estimation, right?
Oh.
So yes, I would kind of put
Well,
that.
that completely detonates my um eschatological views because I think we're coming upon the end of the 6th day.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so
So you're doing your days are strictly 1,000 years. Yeah,
I'm
there
just messing around. But
there. I mean, when I was 17, I liked that idea. Yeah.
no, I think people get carried away with that stuff. But that kind of goes to one of those meme type things you're talking about earlier, where it's
Yeah.
like it kind of sounds cool. I think the name Yahweh was another one where it's like people were going around saying Yahweh. It
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
God's breath. Originally it
Yep.
was Yahweh.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
As though like, God breathed type thing. But
Exactly. And the
um
thing is, like, there's probably a little bit of truth to that, but like,
oh, Yahweh or the 6 days.
no, the thing that Yahweh has to do with the breath, like,
Oh, okay.
like
Oh, interesting.
there is some evidence for that, but well, you have to link it to the idea of like breath is spirit, spirit is
It's really
Yahweh.
speculatory though, isn't it? It's like it's
Well,
one of those things that's it's something you can't ever prove. You just kind of say it's possible.
kind of, except for it, not entirely. Um,
Okay.
because like, okay, so for one thing, like you like in Greek, it's like very like explicit, like because like pneumatic is like and pneuma is breath, right? And it's like
Oh, okay.
it is like the same word for spirit. And so then as soon as you know that like and like then like Elohim, like Ha Elohim, so the Elohim, right? As soon as you make the connection, which Heiser never really seems to, but like it seems obvious to me, but like Elohim is basically like this same sort of a word that we use for spirit. Like they're basically like, so he'll always say that like Elohim is spirit being, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so like as soon as like you kind of like make those sorts of connections, and they're you'll start to the that those connections show up a lot more in like the New Testament, right? Whenever you have like the winds over the water, right? It's like the winds over the water
Yeah.
are supposed to be like, okay, this is like these are spirits that are like over the water, right? And so there are things that are like connected. So then it becomes okay. Well, then it's not a crazy idea to have this idea that the name Yahweh has something to do with breath and how you're like pronouncing it. But that being said, you're no one really knows what those vowel sounds were supposed to be, and so you are taking like a little bit of a leap to be like, oh,
Where you're attaching a specific sound to it versus a
yes,
meaning.
yes,
Yeah.
because
Um,
there is debate about what the specific vowel markings are supposed to be on the tetragrammaton.
yeah. All right. So, Kyle, I'm gonna lay this out there just like for clarity, so you know kind of exactly where I stand. And then you can work on me after that.
Yeah,
But okay, so here's my thing is I view for me, and I like to think of myself as somebody who's reasonably open-minded. I'm not just gonna you know, flip because somebody gives me one quick reason, and then boom, I
sure,
I
sure,
change. But um, here's where I stand: is I look at these ages, and I look at kind of multiple qualifiers, and this is where it's it's challenging for me to see it as anything but literal it because of the way that it's not just a genealogy, it's a genealogy with ages. And so um and it's not just a genealogy with ages, it goes right into it's there's total continuity from Adam all the way through Abraham, all the way to Moses in terms of ages. And so the question, it becomes very tricky to pinpoint, well, when do the ages become real? Do they become real at David? Do they become real at Moses? Do they become, where does the,
sure,
where do real ages kick in?
sure.
Because there's continuity within Genesis. So that's kind of where, like, that's where I currently stand on it.
Right. And so my first kind of like response to that would be, have you heard the arguments about, so like I think most people, if they're doing that, right, what the answer would be like, oh well, once the numbers get down to like a reasonable level of what we know humans can live to, then they're real, right? Like that's sort of where,
Seems a little ad hoc to me.
right, exactly. And the thing is though, is that we actually have some evidence that when the numbers get down to actually things that are more like reasonable, like Joseph's age, Moses's age, Joshua's age, um, there's actually plenty of evidence that those are probably idealized numbers as well, right? So like
Okay.
um, uh, Joshua, or sorry, well, Joseph lives to be 110. Moses lives to be 120, and then I believe it's also Joshua lives to be 110, right? And
Mhm.
um, there's a whole bunch of stuff. So like, if you go look at that article that I linked, they have some stuff in there where they actually right here, right? So there's this whole idea that um, that 120 is like and his day shall be 120. This is supposed to be like the maximal perfect life, right? And then there is some extra biblical evidence that the age of 110 was a perfect age used by the Egyptians, right? And they have some stuff here, right? Which it then makes sense that you would set up this kind of system where um like uh Joseph, who it is in an Egyptian context, um and he's serving there, that he kind of lives the perfect Egyptian life, and he does all that, but he is surpassed by Moses, right, who lives a higher number than him. But then Moses is surpassed by Joshua, who like the the trend line is going back down the other way, right? And so there's um there's some arguments that can be made that those numbers are more realistic, but they might not but they might not be real. Um, and one of the other kind of like for me, for like Moses, for example, so like he lives for 120 years. Moses' life is split up into like perfect 40-year chunks.
Yeah.
They're three perfect 40-year chunks. Um, and it's like it's not unreasonable to imagine that something like that happened, but it's also I don't think it's crazy to be like maybe he lived to 121, maybe he lived to 119, right? It's something like that. And so for me, I think that like if that is the thing that's factually true, I don't think that takes like it, to me it wouldn't take anything away from the Bible if like Moses in fact lived to 121, right? Like that doesn't
No, it doesn't. I agree.
detract from what the Bible is doing.
No, 100% does not.
Um, and
As
so
long as there's a methodology behind it, like you have to accept the way that they once wrote, and historians don't always they're not always perfectly precise with every
no,
last detail. They give generalities on things, and you have to accept that that's a mode of truth. That's not deception. That's how people talk. That's how people write.
right, and the other side of this could be, well, like it is entirely possible that whenever let's say Moses is the one writing a lot of this, um, and Moses wrote down, let's say that Moses wrote down Joshua's, um, or not Joshua, Joseph's age, um, maybe that just was, maybe that just was the age that they passed around in their community, and they weren't referencing like this is the thing. It's entirely possible that that just was his age, and they weren't referencing um this kind of Egyptian idea. Like that's also a viable um that's also a viable explanation for like how it actually got to us. The problem is like with most things whenever you're talking about ancient stuff and we don't have the author just go, hey, why did you write this? We don't know. Um and and so it doesn't um a lot of that stuff I don't think like helps or hurts us really. Um, and so uh,
I I agree, but I do think that there's something like it doesn't ultimately matter, their exact ages. I agree with you that that's like kind of a insignificant detail at the end of the day. I think it can tie into um it can have theological implications depending on which direction you go with things and how far you take them. But I mean, just their mere ages does not have is not an immediate problem, one this way or that way. But I do see an interesting pattern and trend in scripture where you see God working on specific timetables, and somehow just at the right time, the right place and time in history, God moves and does his thing, and it just so happens to align perfectly with what's going on in history. For example, depending on how you interpret the uh, and this is a totally different subject. I'm just trying to make a point here, and that is with Daniel's 490 years, or 400, I should say 70 weeks prophecy. Um, some theologians seem to believe that I can't remember, I think it's from the rebuilding of Jerusalem, or is it from the rebuilding of the temple? The counting begins, and many theologians believe that it basically lands right around the time that Jesus
showed up.
You know, the 69th week is right around the time that Jesus is crucified. Um, and it's just kind of crazy how, what I'm going to is that I think there can be a both and effect with ages where it's like, yeah, somehow that just aligned. Not really sure how. That could be fake, or it could just be God's sovereign hand on history going, I'm you're it's it doesn't seem possible that these things would align, like Judas rejecting Jesus that's prophesied, and yet God doesn't make it happen. It just
Yeah, yeah.
happens.
No,
You know, that type of stuff.
and I mean, I would even uh like to
I don't know if you
kind
catch my drift. I'm not trying
to
to go too
no
off
to kind
course.
I sort of understand what you're saying. Like to kind of even piggyback off of the one that I think about a lot lately is the whole idea of right, we have this idea of there's a 400-year gap between the last um text of the Old Testament and Jesus showing up, right? We have that kind of a gap, and the idea that okay, that they have that there was 400, right, we'll say this whole thing about there was 400 years of silence, where that's not entirely true because like Book of Maccabees and other like Second Temple like stuff
Man,
like
I'm celebrating Hanukkah right now. I
yeah,
don't know about
exactly,
you.
right. But um but you but that's there, and to me I'm like, okay, we probably shouldn't divorce that from the idea of 400 years of slavery and the other instances of 400 showing up and how that relates to how 400 relates to 40. And it's almost always the case that like 440 are um, periods of trial, periods of uh, um, periods of wandering, right? And periods of testing, and like
Yeah.
that's sort of
Yeah.
what's going on there before like before you get to the promised land, before a revelation happens, before um sorry, before like the time of Jesus' temptation is done, right? Of the 40 days, right? And how okay, well, we seem to have this other like 400-year period that nobody really ever seems to talk about, but also kind of lines up with everything else that we just
That's a good point. Yeah.
believe, right?
That's
Uh,
interesting. Yeah.
and so there like there are things like that, and this is usually what I ended up chalking up to. This is like a Jonathan Pajot thing of where he this is why I have the T-shirt, right? That just says symbolism happens, and kind of what it means is that like we live in a world where um there is this like multi-level meaning fractal structure thing that is going on, and sometimes very weirdly things just line up, um and it doesn't really like fully make sense uh as to what's going on, but then when you start mapping it onto the biblical story, somehow um things will start to click, and it's a strange phenomenon that like uh
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying about their ages, though, is like, could it be both? Like,
yeah,
they're little ages, and they fulfilled some sort of typological or, metaphorical meaning as well.
yeah,
Numerological meaning. I don't know.
and I think yeah, I think what I'm saying is that like I'm open to that. It's just I would need like a good argument for like how that's the case, that there's that
Yeah.
I'm open to something literal like going on there. Uh, and
I've always kind of wondered if they had like a different calendar, but I don't
well,
know that that would account for such a large gap. But
it
if they had like a
doesn't.
200-day calendar or something like
Yeah,
that, but I don't think it ever quite mathematically
it, yeah, it
matches.
doesn't
But
get
like,
there, but
I mean, they
there is
measure
like
their days
possibility.
differently. Like evening and morning is the day, and so it's like it makes sense that they might have a different way of measuring a year.
Right.
Um,
I
and
think
then
the
it's like,
Jews
oh,
are
look,
closer to like 360 days, weren't they? I think ancient Jews were closer to 360 days.
Yeah,
We don't know.
there's
Yeah.
like, I mean that. Well, it depends on which Jews you're talking about because they fought about calendars. um, like that's like literally what like the Essenes are. Like the whole thing with like the Essenes is that like they didn't like the way that the rest of the Jews were dealing with their calendar, so they went and lived out in desert caves, and that's why we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's like, thank you for arguing about that. But yeah, there is like that's a possibility, but I also agree. Yeah, I think that there's too much of a large discrepancy to say that that's merely what's going on. Um, that's why I tend to if I'm going to do anything, um, I tend to relate it to the idea of like clans and that there's some kind of passage going on there. But I need to wrap this up. This actually ended up going longer than
Yeah, man. Thank you. Thank you. I'll read some. I'll read the documents you sent and study it a little further.
yeah. Well, talk to you guys later.
Bye.